Whatever thread that has brought you to this group, philosophy is really it's the foundation of it, right? The reason that there's the potential to join a Zoom group to talk about where consciousness and culture are evolving, or what the next step of civilization's evolution, where that's going. All of that framework is created by what I'm arguing is kind of a breakthrough in philosophy, right? That the joke is that science progresses, but philosophy, we can't say there's been any progress in philosophy, and I reject that. I think there's definitely been progress in philosophy, and a lot of it fairly recently. Although much of that progress is occurring outside of the mainstream academies, where the two major branches of philosophy, continental philosophy, primarily based in Europe, and analytic philosophy, primarily in the Anglophone world, those are still the major categories, right? Although there are beginning to be outliers, and the dominant worldview of, physicalism or materialism or scientific naturalism, which is sort of the default position for both continental philosophy and analytic philosophy, despite, numerous notable suggestions. We're in a period where we can see a lot of parallels with the Enlightenment during the late 17th and early 18th centuries, where the dominant reigning academic philosophy of the time was scholasticism, very much a handmaiden of the church. And the new philosophy, as it was called at the time, really kind of broke out of that. And, it was at first... it was considered dangerous, right? Like Spinoza, right, a prominent Enlightenment philosopher, actually had to flee Amsterdam in the middle of the night because they were coming to arrest him for, being heretical. Anyway, philosophy was powerful in the first Enlightenment, and I think it's going to be very powerful. It is, but even though it hasn't, it hasn't kind of reached the attention of the larger society, I can attest that there's been significant progress in philosophy, and I'm hopefully captured some of that in this forthcoming book that I'm working on. In terms of what philosophy can do that can really help the second Enlightenment or the next Renaissance or whatever it is, however we want to frame the birth of this next, hopefully synthetic, inclusive worldview, is that it can help us transcend both modernity and postmodernity. Right, that these two large-scale worldviews that dominate discourse in much of the developed world, they have important dignities, and both of them have made important forms of progress. But in order to transcend these worldviews, we have to transcend their foundational philosophies. And in the case of modernity, at least arguably, its foundational philosophy is, as I mentioned, physicalism or materialism. So transcending materialism philosophically is actually one of the key jobs that need to get done in order to sort of release new sphere emergence, for its next iteration. But also is true of postmodern philosophy, right? Although the impact of philosophy on the Enlightenment is well documented and well known by most. Many of you probably also know that the progressive postmodern worldview philosophy played a role there. The Frankfurt School, Adorno and Marcuse and Foucault, they all had significant impact philosophically. Again, at the level of influence, at the level of academia, but that has trickled down, and more what was once arcane philosophical language becomes blazed across the headlines of the nightly news. So overcoming modernist philosophy means overcoming physicalism. And I would say overcoming postmodern philosophy involves overcoming relativism, right? The hermeneutics of suspicion, as it's been called, so that any hierarchy is bound to be based on, exploitation and a power imbalance. And again, the critiques of the postmodern schools of philosophy have been important, right? And they've been a form of progress, especially if we view that progress in dialectical terms, as, the thesis of modernity, the antithesis of postmodernity, making the way for this next move, which I'm claiming will be very much a move of synthesis. A move that can transcend and include, right? Which is another way of talking about the dialectic. It transcends and includes as it moves beyond, the tension of the pairs. Anyway, not only can philosophy, especially a revived form of philosophy, have a major leverage effect upon breaking away from the natural inertia of the worldviews that currently dominate our civilization. The other thing that I've really found philosophy is extremely good for is illuminating transcendence, right? Illuminating deeper meaning, right? Now, postmodern philosophy has worked hard to do the opposite, right? To promote a kind of nihilism wherein nothing is meaningful, right? You think about if you've ever read Jean-Paul Sartre, they kind of revel in the meaninglessness, and nihilism's worn like a badge, and we kind of have to be grown-ups and wake up and face the fact that, we live in a meaningless universe and that humanity is an accident and the universe is callous and doesn't care. And, you're probably familiar with the tenets of nihilism, which I reject and which I think are clearly, they're civilization killers, thinking like that. And so I care about our civilization, and I hope that it will continue to flourish for the sake of my sons and for all of us. And so I really do think that even though it may not be obvious, we're going to need philosophy, a better form of philosophy. And that's what I think this emerging category, it's been around for a while, but this emerging category, which I'm calling developmental philosophy, in the book that I'm writing, I talk about philosophy's role as one of the three legs of the stool of our humanity's quest for truth or for knowledge. And that they're just like the three legs of a stool. If they come too close together, if one tries to colonize the other, the stool falls over. And so ideally, philosophy's role, at least as I see it, is to bridge and separate science and spirituality or religion. I use religion and spirituality interchangeably, and I have a defense for why that's the case. But just in terms of defined terms, I'm talking about religion and spirituality as though it's just this kind of approach to ultimate reality, which of course includes many different strains and many different kinds, and that's a sort of talk in itself. But what I found that philosophy can do is it can illuminate transcendence by bridging science and spirituality, by giving us the by showing how what science is delivering definitely has deeper meaning. There's transcendence in science. And even though, religion is in decline and spirituality, it doesn't get a lot of good attention in our current media environment. But I think obviously that's full of transcendence, right? That is our various approaches to spirit, whatever spirituality may be your path. I think that's where the mother lode of transcendence and meaning and purpose can be found. Really, it illuminates the good, the true, and the beautiful more than anything. But philosophy can help do it in a way that makes it more powerful, right? So we've seen in my lifetime, it started out. I wasn't interested in philosophy. I was interested in spirituality. I was raised by a single mother. She was agnostic. My father, who I saw occasionally, was a kind of hardcore atheist. So I was never raised in any spiritual tradition. But at an early age, I began to really become attracted to spirituality. I remember looking at the sky when I was a child and thinking, what is all this? What is it really? I didn't have a religious explanation that was pre-supplied. And so I started, this was in the 70s, I started becoming attracted to all the alternative forms of spirituality that were emerging at the time, especially the kinds of spirituality which were attempting to unify or harmonize science and spirituality. Marilyn Ferguson was another one that I read. The Tao of Physics was Fritjof Capra's book. Anyway, in the 70s, when what I'm calling now progressive spirituality, it's sometimes called New Age, but the word New Age is now pretty much reserved for the kind of the most magical thinking elements. But progressive spirituality, including intellectually rigorous disciplines like transpersonal psychology, was very much within the culture of progressive spirituality as emerged in the 70s. And that's where I was very interested. And I read everything I could, including Eastern religious texts, and was a really enthusiastic searcher through my teens. And then in the early 80s, I came across Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, famous evolutionary philosopher. His book, The Phenomenon of Man, kind of changed my life. As I was looking for something that would unify science and spirituality, Teilhard's work, at least at the time in the early 80s when I didn't know any better, it seemed to be the pinnacle of that understanding. And so I tried to read everything that Teilhard had written. I was involved in other elements, but then it was in the late 90s, without recounting my biography, that I came across Whitehead and Wilber and began to really see that there was something going on that was connected to spirituality, but it was more philosophical, it was more intellectually focused than progressive spirituality usually had interest in or time for. And I really devoted myself to that beginning in 2000. And so this would be the 5th integral philosophy book that I'm working on. But as I was working on it, and as I was going back and reading, many of the authors that I had originally read as I'd written my earlier books, I came to see that, I'm realistically, my thinking is closer to Teilhard and Whitehead than it is to, Ken Wilber. I mean, I've been calling what I've been doing integral philosophy, and many of you are coming here through an integral connection. So I want to honor that, and I certainly want to honor Ken Wilber. I don't perhaps do enough of that. But he's had a big influence on my thinking, and I consider myself his ally. And I'm going to talk a little bit about his book when I go through these books that I've been reading. But after having gone to a couple of integral conferences recently, in other words, what integral was when I really dedicated myself to that way of thinking, when 2007, when my book Integral Consciousness came out, integral was a different thing than it is today. And I think in some ways, just going to the conference, integral conference in Sedona, and then this integral conference in Denver that was put on recently, really great conferences. I saw many wonderful people that I've known for years and felt really at home there. But then Andrew and Ilia Delio invited me to what I was amazed to find out was the first academic conference ever given that was the intersection of Alfred North Whitehead and Teilhard de Chardin. And I felt way more at home at that conference than I felt at any of these other conferences. And I began to realize that I can't call what I'm doing process philosophy, which is, Whitehead's philosophy. And I know many Whiteheadians kind of claim that Teilhard was at least technically a process philosopher. Ilia Delio, one of the leading scholars of Teilhard, claims that he's not, that he's more of it's modified dualism or whatever. But regardless, I think that this category that's emerging, developmental philosophy, I'm calling it, and I'd like to define it as the family of philosophical views that are concerned with the deeper dimensions of the universe's becoming. Right? What is the universe? It's evolution. Evolution, that's one way of saying the universe is what it does. It's in the process of becoming in time. And that this getting a grip on this is actually something that these various philosophies, so process philosophy, probably number one, the most vibrant and still, the philosophy that's both widely popular and has a lot of academic rigor still. There's a lot of activity going on with process philosophy, and I'm definitely feel very allied with it and want to recommend any of you to look at many of the wonderful books and talks and conferences that are being put on in that field. But Teilhard, again, he can't be classified as a process philosopher. So, I guess we could call him an evolutionary philosopher. The trouble with the word evolutionary is that if you look it up, it's already taken in two ways that we can distinguish from this family of philosophies that are concerned with the deeper meaning of what we now know about evolution, about our origins. And that includes, evolutionary philosophy is more reserved, at least within modernist discourse, as philosophy of biology. Like the leading names are Daniel Dennett and Richard Dawkins, and most recently like David Sloan Wilson, right? That if we were to talk about evolutionary philosophy and just throw that term around as a general category, then it could easily be confused for these other forms. And they're certainly looking at the meaning of evolution, but they're in the theoretical handcuffs of physicalism, right? They can't see the interior universe, which all of these other philosophies that I'm identifying through this loose category I'm calling developmental philosophy. And so the book that I'm working on is an attempt to contribute to developmental philosophy, and it doesn't really fall squarely into any of these other categories, which is part of the reason why we're talking about this. Why we want to have a big tent of all the different views, and I don't expect that the term developmental philosophy will necessarily catch on. And as I mentioned, there's not, philosophy as a subject is already overly categorized, right? There's already too many, splitting hair categories. And that's actually a defense, because if you start criticizing one of the higher level categories, they'll immediately say, well, that's different from we're talking about this category, right? So, physicalism, for example, oh no, there's many different kinds of, you can't criticize that philosopher as being a physicalist because he doesn't mean the same thing. I mean, okay, fine. Let's have, 1,001 categories. But in addition to splitting, we also need some lumping. We also need to say, okay, what is the type of philosophy that's going to become the foundation of the second enlightenment? And I would say that a good candidate for a category would be developmental philosophy, because I don't see it as coming directly out of process philosophy or integral philosophy by itself. That we need something looser, something that include outliers like Henri Bergson, right, or even Teilhard, and some of the philosophers I'm going to talk about tonight. Another way of talking about developmental philosophy is the developmental perspective, right, which is another name. There's a whole bunch of names here that I've kind of thrown against the wall over the past 4 years to see if they stick. I mean, the developmental perspective is one that's gained traction in terms of this view that sees things as moving and can see consciousness with a vertical dimension of development. And in the book, I have a whole chapter that devoted to what is the developmental perspective and how it could be practiced. But before that, I was calling it integral consciousness. But I didn't really want to focus too much on integral consciousness, because the term integral is more and more associated directly with Ken Wilber, and I don't begrudge him the ownership of that term. I think if anybody's qualified to claim integral, it's him, and that's fine with me. And I'll probably be calling what we're about integral for the rest of my life. But when it comes to book titles and formal discourse, again, we need a better category so we don't get artificially lumped in with any of these other groups. This developmental perspective, we tried marketing it, in other words, promoting it in the marketplace of ideas as cultural intelligence, right? Like emotional intelligence is something that smart people have. You should have it too, right? But none of these things quite, caught on. So we're really, I've settled on the developmental perspective because it's a little bit like, environmental awareness, right? Environmental awareness is something that, we can trace all the way back to, St. Francis of Assisi. But it really emerges and gains a lot of traction culturally with the emergence of progressive postmodernism. But that environmental consciousness trickles down. In other words, modernists and traditionalists can use it too. And so the developmental perspective is a way of labeling what I'm talking about with something that can be used by anyone, even if they haven't adopted, the postmodern worldview, right? In other words, there's levels of these things. And I want to make sure that people appreciate that this perspective is something you can take on and put off. It's not necessarily a personal identity. It's just a powerful tool for viewing the interior of things and seeing internal universe phenomenon like dialectical development and stages of consciousness and culture and values themselves and their energetic effect on our minds. So, developmental philosophy is this category. If you hear me talking about it, it's at least in the subtitle of my book. This gives a kind of a general description of what I mean, and you can ask me more about it in the questions. I also wanted to add that the evolutionary is not only a troubled term for a label of a postmodern philosophy. It's because of its primary association with modernist physicalists. It's also become highly closely associated with New Age spirituality, right? The Evolutionary Leaders is a New Age book club. Book authors club that I used to belong to, but now the headliners are Greg Braden and Bruce Lipton, right? Who are very much in this progressive spirituality category. And I certainly wouldn't want to identify as being really, serious philosophers or developmental philosophers for sure. So, the term developmental works for psychology. Developmental psychology has been called that for 40 years now, at least. And we've also got developmental politics, which worked pretty well as a brand of thinking about politics, which still has traction. And so now it seemed obvious that developmental philosophy would be, the next way of framing what we're doing and talking about it in general terms that are inclusive. And so that's what developmental philosophy is, and that's why you see it as the title of our YouTube channel and our Facebook group. I wouldn't call it a brand, because we're not doing marketing. That was something that's like an important thing we've learned. I mean, we still want to bring this perspective to the larger marketplace of ideas. And I'm certainly going to promote my book when it comes out and the work of the Institute for Cultural Evolution. But this is some important learning that I shared in April when I talked about the beginning of the book. And that is that when developmental politics, my 2020 book, when it came out, it seemed like the obvious course was to not just promote the book. When the book, tour was over, we felt like, wow, this could be a political movement unto itself. And so, we hired people. I spent a lot of time raising money, organization building, and all that was worthwhile. And I'm proud of what we created, and it still has life for sure. But we got to the point in 2023 when we realized that promoting, ideas, making little videos and, working on Twitter and figuring out, how to make it simpler and simpler and simpler and infographics and, just trying to help it catch on. Well, I think it definitely will catch on. And we've brought many people into the orbit of this, as evidenced by the growth of this group. But at the same time, we're not going to market our way to the second enlightenment, is the bottom line. The board of directors of the Institute for Cultural Evolution said, realistically, it doesn't make sense for you, Steve, to be spending all your time working as a nonprofit businessman, raising money and doing marketing. The biggest impact we could have on our mission, which is to help bring about, this next emergence in human history, the most impactful thing we could do right now is to send you to write another book. And I mentioned Jeff Salzman being really instrumental in saying, no, Steve, you need to write another book. And I didn't want to. It's hard. Like I said, I'm crawling across the driveway bare-chested across the broken glass, trying to make my way to the other side. But it's also, like I said, a joy, and it's coming along pretty good. I'm excited about it. So working on philosophy in the same way that in 2012, when Carter and I co-founded the Institute for Cultural Evolution, we were looking at climate change, but we thought, climate change is downstream from political polarization. Part of the reason that the United States has a kind of a democracy problem regarding addressing climate change is because of it's become a political football, right? It's become captured by progressive postmodernists, at least in the minds of voters on the right. So we said, okay, well, let's go upstream, let's work on political polarization. And we're kind of doing something similar now in the sense that upstream from political polarization is a lack of transcendence, a lack of deeper meaning within our society that can serve as a foundation of our social solidarity, right? And so reviving a form of inclusive transcendence, that the deeper meaning of the universe, that it can be read right off what science has recently delivered in terms of knowledge, and it can be bridged to a deeply spiritual meaning through philosophy, that brokers between those two different kinds of truth. This is where I'm focusing now, and I am optimistic about the prospects for the impact of this work. But as I've been working on the book, new philosophy books keep coming out. And I have to keep up, right? Because some of these books are really quite powerful, and I can't write a philosophy book without having made sure that the thinking in these latest books are under my belt. And certainly, several books that Andrew Davis has recently written have been influential, and just my friendship with Andrew. He came and presented back in, I think it was in May, and if you have a chance, check out Andrew's presentation, which is on our YouTube channel, Developmental Philosophy. But a book, I'm going to go through 7 paper books that I have here, and I'm just going to say a few remarks about them, and if you want to talk about them, I'm still not going to give a book review of any of these books, but I'll sort of just frame them a little bit in terms of my appreciation of them. And if you want to bring these books up in the conversation that we'll have after I go through these books, that'd be great. So the first book is this book that just came out a couple of weeks ago. And this is a book by David Bentley Hart. It's called All Things Are Full of Gods. And this is a rigorous philosophy book about philosophy of mind. And Hart is a controversial figure. He is an academic philosopher. I think he was recently a guest professor a visiting professor at Notre Dame. But I don't think he's directly affiliated. The book is published by Yale University Press, and it consists of a dialogue, a kind of an imaginary dialogue between 4 Greek gods who are talking about philosophy of mind. But it's basically focused on each one of the dominant theories of philosophy of mind, namely like the problem of consciousness, right? How does the brain generate consciousness, right? Can consciousness be reduced to the brain? These are some of the main areas of focus within contemporary academic philosophy of mind. And if you go, for example, to this long-running conference in Tucson, the Science and Consciousness Conference, I think it's called, you'll see that almost everybody there is a partisan of one of these prevailing theories of mind. You know, you have people like David Chalmers and Thomas Nagel, and so this is where a lot of the action is in professional philosophy right now, is philosophy of mind. And there have been many ingenious theories, right, that have been promulgated over the last few years, such as integrated information theory, right, which I'm not going to try to explain here. It's very technical. But the idea is that, as information gets integrated sufficiently, then that creates an interior which creates consciousness. So any way that we can integrate information, we're going to get consciousness out of it. And so Hart takes on school by school, almost, philosopher by philosopher in contemporary philosophy of mind, and makes an extremely powerful critique of every one of them. An alternative nickname for this book could become not all things are full of gods, but all theories are full of shit. Because he really just dismantles them pretty effectively. His personality comes through in the gods, the Greek gods who are the protagonists of the book, and they're kind of sniffy. They're kind of they have that sort of that pompous regard for each other that's kind of cute, so it makes it lively reading if you're interested in philosophy. My critique is towards the end, he has this sort of neo-perennialist theology of Advaita Vedanta and Christianity, and it's all kind of meshed together in a way that I think is, maybe I've read his 2013 book, The Experience of God, which was another masterpiece. I got a lot out of that book, but I haven't read everything Hart has written. But from what I have read, his personal philosophy is not very well developed. He kind of throws it out at the end. Maybe some of you are students of Hart and you might disagree with me, but he's not so much a developmental philosopher in the sense that he doesn't, he neo-Darwinian explanations are among the philosophies that come into his crosshairs. But he doesn't talk about the evolution of civilization or the evolution of the noosphere. I mean, partially because he's very much a traditionalist, extremely high-powered traditionalist. But nevertheless, what he does add, and what I got a lot out of having read this book pretty intensely over the last few weeks, is that he really illuminates the interior universe in a way that it's extremely clear, right? In other words, that from his perspective, I mean, he quotes Schelling, the German idealist philosopher Schelling, in saying that, I'm going to get the quote right. He says, nature is visible spirit and spirit is invisible nature, meaning that it's too narrow to call what Hart is doing idealism, right? Because idealistic philosophy, we haven't get a cartoon version of it, so we have materialist philosophy as everything is matter, and then we have idealist philosophy as everything is mind, right? And of course, the critique is that leads to solipsism, meaning that it's all in your head. And early versions of idealism like Berkeley, right, for whom the school is named, have been thoroughly refuted. It's sort of dead in the water, that kind of early idealism. But Hart brings a kind of a broadened perspective, what we might call today cosmopsychism, right? That the universe is in the mind of a superintelligent being. And that nature and empirical reality are real, but they're still, mind is first. One of the things that I got out of his book especially was how, in my 2012 book, Evolution's Purpose, I talk about emergence, right? And one of the things about developmental philosophy especially is that it's illuminating the structure of evolutionary emergence, right? From the Big Bang to where we are, all of which is embodied in our bodies. I've talked about that a lot in previous discussions. How the structure of emergence, although it's physical in some ways, is also deeply metaphysical because it involves not just the objective, but the subjective and the intersubjective as well, right? But that's its own talk. I don't want to get sidetracked by trying to talk about that too much. But this structure of emergence, wherein something more keeps coming from something less, is one of the, I think, spiritual teachings of evolution. One of the most profound things that we can read off the recent science of the last few decades. And what Hart really makes clear with his powerful arguments is that the idea of strong emergence, that consciousness just emerges out of matter, that's like hand waving. It's just, in other words, strong emergence is a kind of magic because there's no explanation for it. And while there's weak emergence, these are all technical philosophical distinctions, but even that doesn't get us to consciousness. It's really what he's showing is that mind emerges from mind, and that we have mind because we live in a universe of deeper mind that permeates all of reality. And he makes an excellent case for that, not just in his affirmative statements of it, but most powerfully in his devastating critiques of all of the different attempts within this, trying to stay within the orbit somehow of physicalism, and yet not breaking out of that materialist paradigm. I mean, even people who are still allowing for interiority and allowing that consciousness can't be reduced to matter are still playing the game in terms of the rules of scientific naturalism that we've inherited over the past 300 years, and which I mentioned are still dominant. So I think Hart's book is historically important because it helps do what I mentioned earlier, the two tasks, transcending modernity and transcending postmodernity. And his book definitely helps as part of his whole his whole mission as a philosopher, is to focus on transcending, reductionistic physicalism and indeed physicalism of all kinds. Okay, so the next book, it's actually two books I want to mention that I've read recently, right? I've been reading all kinds of books, but these two, this is Iain McGilChrist. Okay, and Iain McGilChrist is an important philosopher who I want to praise and say that I am his ally as well. And I got a lot out of these books. What's particularly meaningful in McGilChrist's work is just there's so many points of his philosophy that are, standard features of integral philosophy and process philosophy, and he writes beautifully, and he really brings these out, in a really, his credibility as a philosopher when his book came out, Hart's book came out in August 24. McGilChrist's 2-volume set came out in March 2023. And when McGilChrist's book came out, it was reviewed by Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, in the Los Angeles Times Review of Books. And he's getting some good traction there. And so I'm really glad to see, his philosophy, even though, I wouldn't exactly call him a developmentalist, but I'm glad to see that here is a spiritual philosophy that's intellectually rigorous, that deals with many important topics which are near and dear to my heart, including panentheism, panpsychism, kenosis theology, right? These are all technical terms. We can talk about those in a minute if you want. But again, I'm very close to McGilChrist and applaud his work. The only critique I will offer respectfully in this moment is to say that, that as one reviewer put it, it's a kind of reductionistic critique of reductionism. And that is that the idea that all of the matter with things, right, the matter with modernist consciousness, the matter with physicalism, is that it's very left brain, and the left brain is good for focusing on details, but the right brain is way more important for the future of humanity. And that his prescription for development is basically to change from a left brain dominated way of thinking as a society to a right brain dominant way of thinking. And I mean, that's fine as far as it goes, but it doesn't take into account the role of modernist consciousness as a worldview that's particularly agentic and individualistic. It's not just the left brain. We can't just reduce it to neurology. And I could also say that it's going to take a lot more than just shifting our focus by admonishing us to be more right-brained. That the evolution of the noosphere is far more detailed than that, and that we need a more detailed description, and that requires we look at how society has changed in the past, which means we recognize worldviews, we recognize the evolution of consciousness, we recognize noosphere evolution overall, and McGilChrist does all of those things to a degree, but not to the degree that I would humbly like to see. Nevertheless, I recommend that book. Check it out if you have a chance. For the 2 books, $130, but it's published by Perspectiva, which is integrally adjacent as a think tank in London, and so your money goes to help Perspectiva, which could be good. Next, just coming through these 7 books that I'm been reading recently, Finding Radical Wholeness, by Ken Wilber. This book came out in June 2024. And I've read it with great interest and found parts of it to be very excellent and stimulating and, confirmatory, right? It's some of the same thoughts that he's arrived at independently, that we've been talking about. And so, like I mentioned, Ken Wilber is an ally. We're not colleagues. We don't talk. He's got his cultural sphere, and, I don't fit, keenly in there. But nevertheless, there's lots of overlap between what he's writing and what I'm writing. And it's great to see a fresh exposition in this book. Is previous to The Religion of Tomorrow and Trump in a Post-Truth World. Some of his more recent books have been, somewhat repetitive, right? Somewhat heavy on color jargon, at least for my taste. But here, he's, in my opinion, a little bit more lucid, Finding Radical Wholeness. Although, it's a philosophy book and a kind of a self-help book. I applaud that. I think that making it relevant for people's personal growth is an important application of integral philosophy, and I think Wilber does a great job there. Some of my objections to Wilber, I wouldn't say objections, I would just say differences. Some of those are laid out in the critiques that are going to be in my book. And when the book comes out, not only will I give a presentation, but I'll give presentations for each of those critiques so we can really unpack them. I have a critique of the quadrant model, which I think, like all these models, is true but partial, and that could be improved. An important part of improving developmental philosophy so that it's ready for prime time, ready to have its major impact, involves actually improving the philosophy itself, which is upstream. And so I'm not claiming to necessarily have improved on Ken Wilber's philosophy, but I think every philosophy improves by critique. Right? That's actually what philosophers do, is they critique each other. And it's not just to gain, points in academia. It's because it's a pursuit of truth. And we think about truth as like a ladder. It's like a ladder of ascension, because as soon as we can frame one rung of the ladder, as soon as one thing is clearly true, it's only when you make it true that you can see, other philosophers at least can see, other people, smart people can see the partiality of that truth. All truth is true but partial, maybe except for a few, basic propositions. But philosophical truth is always partial. There's always partialities in every truth. And that's why it's a ladder, because once you grip one rung, then that allows you to see the next rung. And so philosophy engages in criticism when at its best, at least, as a truth practice, as using the points of partiality in any truth to as a point of departure. Right? It's the partial that is the opening for further evolution in the truth toward our understanding of what's true. So Wilber's book is good. I recommend it. It's one of his best books in a long time, and I have critiques of it. I'll leave it by saying that perhaps my main critique is that Ken Wilber's a spiritual teacher as well as a philosopher, and much of the book is devoted to, I don't know what the right word is, but recommending his particular spiritual path, which he puts as, get samadhi. Right? Have a non-dual experience, right? Wake up. I mean, his thing is growing up, waking up, showing up, opening up, cleaning up, all these different phrases of personal development. And one of those is to have a waking up experience. And I certainly think that having a spiritual experience is very important for personal growth. But I think there's many kinds of spiritual experience besides samadhi. And I think that it's a rich lineage of both Advaita Vedanta Hinduism and Vajrayana Buddhism, but also Zen Buddhism, that Wilber represents. And I'm not critiquing that spiritual teaching or that spiritual path. I think it's a highly venerable and important spiritual path that many people I love dearly and I know have grown authentically through it. So I want to affirm the norm of spiritual pluralism and say that that's a very important part of spirituality, and it's got a lot of truth in it. And for some people, it makes a marvelous path. It's just not my path. And so when a particular spiritual path is advanced, it's though it's empirical. I have to differ, right? So then I'm not a follower of Wilber's spiritual teaching, but I am definitely a fan of his philosophy, and that's about as much as I'll say regarding that. Coming to the fifth book, this is a book, Why? The Purpose of the Universe by Philip Goff. This book came out in, let's see what we got here. Came out in November 2023. And when I first read it, I was excited by it. It's a thin book, as you can see, published by Oxford University Press, so it's an academic book. But Goff goes to great lengths to try to make it accessible and popular, right? So he's got a chapter, and then he says, it's almost condescending. He's trying to tell us how to read the book, so just read this part, and then you can skip the last part because that's really nerdy, and only professional philosophers will appreciate that, right? And I guess that's kind. Some readers may appreciate that. What's really powerful about Goff's book is that he's, especially the English academia, very much intensely captured by physicalism, right? Dawkins, analytic philosophy. So Goff is in the culture, the academic culture of physicalism, and he's very much wearing these physicalist frames, playing by those rules. And yet he's still breaking out of it. Like he's showing what it means to be, kind of in that camp, and yet just, I mean, the most famous to do that is Thomas Nagel, in his, I think it was the 2013 book, Mind and Cosmos, with a subtitle of something like, Neo-Darwinism must be wrong, But Goff's book, I think the biggest strength of it is he talks about what he calls the value selection hypothesis. And that is, if we were to look at science and see what we now know about the universe, it's pretty clear that the universe is selecting for value, right? That the good, the true, and the beautiful are in the aims of the universe, which is, of course, beautifully brought out by Whitehead and Hart. So Goff's not adding a lot there. What he is adding, though, is saying, given the evidence from what we can now see, why isn't this the default hypothesis? And he has a chapter that's that I particularly appreciated, where he examines what's called the fine-tuning of the constants of physics, the expansion rate of the universe. And there's so many features of science, hundreds actually, that demonstrate that the values are poised on a knife edge. That if they were infinitesimally different one way or the other, then not only would life be impossible, but a complex universe of any kind would be impossible. And there have been all these kind of gaslighting arguments, like, okay, well, the universe must be random, so the only way we're going to get randomness in our highly tuned, purposeful universe is we're going to posit an infinite number of universes. We just happen to hit the cosmic jackpot, right? Our universe is fine-tuned randomly, which is like such preposterously bad theology that it's laughable. But at the same time, this is like a leading hypothesis among, physicists and philosophers of science. And, Goff really shows, using Bayesian logic, like the idea of the multiverse doesn't even follow logically from the fact that we now have this fine tuning that's staring us in the face, right? So, I liked Goff. He's also a proponent of panpsychism, although it's pretty weak tea, panpsychism. It doesn't really get to the heart of the beauty of this idea that the interior universe is everywhere. He kind of just plays lip service to it, but he's a millennial. He's moving along in his philosophical evolution, and hopefully he'll become more and more amenable to developmental philosophy as time progresses. But I recommend the book, Why. It was kind of fun reading, even though it sort of ends with a dud. Another book I want to just highlight quickly is Sister Ilia Delio's book, The Not Yet God, Carl Jung, Teilhard de Chardin, and the Relational Whole. I read Ilia's book came out in August 2023, and she gave me a copy when I went to Villanova University for the conference that she co-curated with Andrew Davis, and was on her podcast. Really enjoyed our conversation, and Ilia is going to be our guest speaker for November. So she'll be coming on. She'll be talking about Teilhard de Chardin's Omega Point, which I assumed I knew what it was. But when I met Ilia and heard her talk, and most importantly, her defense, she was like parrying the thrusts, and it was like, wow, this is much bigger and more profound than I had thought it was. And so she's going to come back and give a talk about the Omega Point, not just Teilhard's concept of it, but what we've come to understand about it as this philosophy makes progress, right? Developmental philosophy that the Teilhardians are clearly, centrally located within this category that I'm describing. Another book that I've read recently, this one came out in 2021. This is called Metamodernism, The Future of Theory, by Jason Storm, who's an academic at Williams College. And, metamodernism, it's arguably a kind of developmental philosophy, but my main critique of it in generally is it doesn't really escape nihilism. It doesn't make its way beyond secular spirituality, right, and the constraints of that. But some may differ. And then, like I mentioned earlier, it's hard to critique anything, especially called metamodernism, because there's about at least 10 different metamodernisms, all vying for, the sort of the capturing the field of that term. What they all have in common is that they are all developmental in the extent that they're recognizing modernity, postmodernity, and then meta-modernity as being metamodernism being a kind of the transition of postmodernism. Now, of course, they all disagree about what postmodernism is, right? So, Hansi Freineck, that author uses spiral dynamics, right, to talk about what metamodernism is. But Jason Storm certainly doesn't have anything close to spiral dynamics. He makes these grand Hegelian flourishes at the beginning, where he talks about the emergence of postmodernity, and then this goes beyond, and it's the negation of the negation, and many things that I resonate with and write about myself. But ultimately, it's thoroughly embedded within postmodernism. I mean, the whole discourse is about Derrida and Foucault and recovering, taking postmodern philosophy seriously, which, again, I think it should be taken seriously. But I don't think that Jason Storm gets there. Ultimately, he gets bogged down in identitarian politics and taking ideas like, phallocentrism seriously. So he also claims to be the first metamodern philosopher. So I don't know how other metamodern philosophers who are vying for influence in that space would feel about it. But I don't recommend this book. I just want to show you that this is an academic book, again, published by University of Chicago. But it's not only trapped within postmodernism, but it's trapped within the peccadillos of academia at the moment in a way that renders it unsatisfying. Finally, I just want to show this book quickly. First Principles and First Values. I know Jeff didn't like this book very much. We talked about it quite a bit. I read it and actually liked it. It's the David J. Temple is the combination of Mark Gaffney and Zach Stein. And, Mark is a controversial figure, but he is certainly an expert at integral philosophy, as is Zach Stein. They're both very brilliant. And even though I can't go along with Mark's rendition of what he calls cosmoerotic humanism, nor can I buy into the catastrophism of the meta-crisis, I think there's certainly threats to our civilization, and I certainly take climate change seriously. But I think that the doomsaying has become its own cultural niche, and it's almost like junk food for postmodern consciousness. They can't help themselves because, the idea that our civilization is going to be doomed, it's like catnip. They just love that. And so this idea of the meta-crisis, it's overblown. And I know some of you may argue with me. I don't think that in order to take climate change seriously and to realize that it's a dire threat and to work tirelessly in my number one political issue, but it doesn't have to be apocalyptic for it to be a big deal, right? We don't. As a matter of fact, I think the extensive catastrophizing is part of the problem. It keeps us from making a transition as a civilization, right? And I make some of those arguments in my white paper about climate change that's published on the Institute for Cultural Evolution site. But what I really love about Mark and Zach's book is that they're whereas some of these other books have kind of metaphysical allergies. These guys embrace metaphysics wholeheartedly, and they really talk about a shared story of value. How we need a new story of value. We need to revalorize value, if you will, and recognize how it's fundamental to the universe. And so, and to that extent, I'm deeply allied with these guys, and wanted to give a shout out to their book. Despite the controversies surrounding the authors, it's a thoroughly integral text and one that is worth checking out. So I could go on and on. I think I've already gone on too long, but I appreciate your interest in what I've been reading and some of these critiques. And I appreciate you letting me share what I'm up to philosophically. I'd love to hear your comments, questions, critiques, anything that you can they have to say regarding what I've just rambled on about.
Thank you so much, Steve. Yes, I see Andrew Davis has already raised his hand. If you have a question, comment, challenge, and support, click the react button, raise hand, and I'll get you in the queue. We probably have time for a few questions here. Boy, I got some reading to do, Steve.
All right. Yeah, they're all good books, all worth checking out.
All right, let's go with...
Except maybe Metamodernism. You could probably skip that.
Sounds good. Andrew Davis, go for it.
All right. Thanks, Roger. Yeah. Hey, Steve. Thanks for a great overview. You're sort of whetting our appetites here for the new book. So I'm excited to read it and certainly help advertise it from our end. I love the text you're mentioning as they're fantastic resources. I'm familiar all but the Wilber text and then the Metamodern text, which I probably won't get to, but certainly the other texts I've read and done so closely. Um, One thing I love about you is you're quite willing to say who you're drawing upon, but then you're always going to tell us where you disagree with them. So I like that aspect of your philosophizing. You're pointing to where the critiques need to be made too, and I think that's very important. We academics can be overly polite sometimes. I just think it's important to include that critical dimension.
Well, I mean, it's
Just a,
important in the
yeah,
sense, let me just comment on that and say that, look, we're all
sure,
in these political environments and things have been more politicized than they ever have been, right? So
yeah,
naturally, I want to be, allied with McGilChrist. I don't want to say anything negative, but he's a philosopher. I'm a philosopher. You're a philosopher.
sure.
We've got to be able to have a space of agreement where we can, constructively critique each other. And I don't see enough of that. So thank you for recognizing it.
Yeah, well, I was just going to follow up. Yes, it's essential. It must happen. I just put in the chat. We recently hosted McGilChrist, the California Institute for Integral Studies and the Center for Process Studies in March, and got to get to know him quite well. It was a conference on his thought. So, I mean, I would love to help facilitate a dialogue between you and him. Maybe we do it on the developmentalist site here. We have the means of doing that. If you're interested, just to see how I'm quite interested to see how he'd respond to
Of course,
some of the
I'm
critiques,
interested. I mean,
the
he's
sort of reverse,
yeah, he's
yeah, reverse
one of the most
reduction.
influential philosophers alive today. So I'd love to talk to him if he'd,
Yeah.
be willing.
Yeah, and quite a nice fellow too. So happy to help with that. Maybe we can talk about that later. But my question I was going to pose is, we talked about whether philosophy does work. Um, and some of the critiques of philosophy are the armchair philosophers who are almost exclusively concerned with theory and metaphysics and does it actually do anything? But I think there's an interesting movement, I'm sure you are aware of it, online that's trying to reawaken the ancient origins of philosophy as a guide for life. It's this practical dimension, even a spiritual dimension, as Pierre Hadot would say, that has always been wedded to philosophy. So I'm just curious if you would comment on the practical and theoretical dimensions and how you see those related. And I'm sure you go into it in the book, but we don't, in theory affects practice. So we need the theory, but not just the theory. I'm just wondering how you see that relationship.
Sure. Well, I mean, that's a very wide and deep, how do you use philosophy? What's it good for? And I try to mention some of the things. Part of it is socially applicable, right? How can we grow as a civilization, as a society? And so those who are called to participate in that growth, and there's all kinds of different lines of growth. There's not just philosophy, but philosophy is not only, its own line, but it's also a very important supplement. Because if whatever movement you may be attracted to, I would argue that there's philosophy at the root of it. That philosophy can certainly be found, even if it's not connected with any particular kind of professional philosophy. Understanding where it connects with the world body of philosophy is very important for understanding, what its potential is and what its weaknesses are. Right? Any efforts to improve the world. But there's also a way in which I think I mentioned too that philosophy evolves your consciousness. It's literally, I mean, again, I don't want to make it into self-help, right? I mean, self-help has its big limits, right? Which I kind of made fun of the idea of cultural intelligence, right? Because it's too much self-help, right? Too much, for the budding leader, for the junior executive, it's like, no. What philosophy is about making your mind stronger, making your perspective wider, and the best kind of philosophy is a philosophy that expands what you can value, right? And according to Whitehead, that's a direct way that you evolve your consciousness, is that your ability to appreciate intrinsic value grows. So it's definitely a work of the mind, but for me, it's deeply centered in my heart and in my work in the world. And I know yours too. So I'm glad to see the an online movement, so to speak, about making philosophy cool, making philosophy useful, making it pragmatic, giving people tools, handles. But I think that at least my critique of that would be philosophy in general, right, is pretty weak tea. It's in other words, what's happening now isn't the philosophy of Kant. It's the philosophy of developmental philosophy, this process philosophy. It's like we have all this new truth from science, right? Science has delivered a mother lode of new truth that we haven't digested appropriately yet. And it's in the digestion and appreciation of the deeper meanings that it's clear from the science itself, right? Even if it's still tentative, right? Even if science is still moving along, we get to inhabit a future. It's almost like philosophy transports you into the future. And certain kinds of philosophies can drag you into the past, right? Like materialism, that's a dead philosophy. And yet, if you just talk about philosophy in general, you're still going to be dominated by that because the academies are still dominated by it. So I would say that philosophy in general, promote it if you can, certainly a good thing. But I would say that we have to get a little bit more specific if we want to make it most useful.
Beautiful. And the last thing I'll say, just as you said about philosophy dragging us into the future, I think that's part of philosophy's role. And I can recommend to you and to everybody a wonderful book by the Russian scholar Mikhail Epstein. And his book is The Philosophy of Possibility. And he argues that in philosophy, for too long, has looked to the past. It's been about the actual, about what it was, when in reality, sorry, I'm coffee shop here. It's about that lure towards the possible, what we still can be, and seeing that from the standpoint of current actuality. So I know we could go on. I love your work, and we're happy to help spread it. So keep me posted on.
Okay, sure. And folks here, make sure to check out Andrew's latest offerings because they're awesome. Andrew is one of my favorite philosophers. Yeah.
That's kind.
Thanks, Andrew. All right, David.
Hey, Steve. Great presentation here. I'm super excited to see the developmental philosophy that you've given us a brief peek behind the kimono here tonight to see what's coming. You mentioned the Towards the Science of Consciousness conference. I was at one of those back in '97, and there was a panel of philosophers, and they were asked, what has philosophy contributed to all of our understanding here? How is philosophy helping us? And they were all five mute. None of them, they all were kind of like looking to see who was going to go first. So I'm excited to see you're changing that trajectory of philosophy here and offering this developmental lens, because so many of the things that I see happening, the developmental framework you've offered seems to be the perfect center tent pole that is clear, simple, direct, and accurate, but then also allows the other tents to expand beneath it. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about some of the handles that you mentioned, some of the implications or applications that you might give us a little teaser preview of, as to see how you see that showing up and making an impact in our world here in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years or so.
Sure. Well, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, I think philosophy serves it has a foundational role in almost every system of thought you can imagine. And so we really see, the question of what impact does philosophy have? It builds civilization, right? It's hard if you're an academic philosopher and you're like this to come up with such a sweeping statement, and it certainly wouldn't be, academically fashionable to do so. But you look at the golden age of ancient Greece, right? That is sort of like the Platonic essence of Western civilization there at the beginning. And where did that come from? It came from philosophy. It came from the string of geniuses that they had, the pre-Socratics and the Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. And that philosophy is still living philosophy today. It's still serving as a foundation, just as the buildings that we're sitting in are all resting on foundations. We're not giving any thought to those foundations, but they're there doing important work, right? And so is Aristotle, right, and Plato. But again, we don't have to go that far back in history. I mentioned the Enlightenment, right? Modernity, right? What is it? It's a worldview. Where did it come from? It's founded on philosophy, right? Which, we could say it's founded on science, but science at the time of the birth of the Enlightenment was called natural philosophy, right? Science as its own, three leg of the stool, emerged from philosophy during the Enlightenment. And yet it was not only the philosophy that led to the empirical method, that led to science, that led to the Industrial Revolution. It was also the philosophy not only was a foundation of the Enlightenment's truth, it was also the foundation of the Enlightenment's goodness, in the sense of the very idea of liberal values and personal freedom and democracy and all of the things we sort of take for granted now. Those are all products of philosophy. And so what are the pragmatic ways that you can use philosophy now? I mean, I would again say that it's got a foundational role, is that it's philosophy, this new developmental philosophy, and going back to Hegel really, and Whitehead, of course, it's not new in that sense, but it's new in the sense that it's consolidating and gaining a new purchase on the culture. At least that's my hope and my intention, along with many others. This category I'm naming doesn't just come from me. Right? It's not just my springing fresh from my brow. It's the work of, thousands of people, not only the great, heroes of philosophy, but all kinds of people who are involved with this in, making it visible within the culture, online, et cetera. So the philosophy is good for putting you in a position to participate into the next great Renaissance. Right? And who doesn't want to do that? Right? If you were living in, 1470, wouldn't you want to be in Florence? Well, now, we're no longer limited to places. We have, the virtual world, and you can be in a place that is the Florence of the next Renaissance right now by getting into these realms of philosophy where the seeds are beginning to sprout, right? But I could also say more pragmatic things like politics, like we've got this problem with political polarization, right? And the intensity of that. How can we make sense of it? Well, a lot of books have come out trying to analyze polarization and say where it comes from. And they almost all come down to, let's have better civil discourse and these kind of bromides about we're all in it together. And those are good as far as you can go. But in order to understand our political polarization, we have to understand these worldview systems that are vying for the values of the larger civilization. And we can't get at those through social science, right? Social science is ill-equipped it's tried to replace philosophy, but because it's got the handcuffs of empiricism, it can't get at the interior universe in the way philosophy can. So philosophy is very powerful at showing us these interior universe phenomena, like dialectical relationships, like worldviews, like value energy, like this yearning for transcendence, which is behind both, Magistan and Wokistan, right? They're both yearning for transcendence. And so if we understand transcendence better and understand where there is a plausible path to our recovering it, maybe not, for everyone, but in a very inclusive and social solidarity building way, then these are pragmatic applications. But at the very least, it's entertaining because it's definitely emerging now, and there's all kinds of exciting things happening.
Well, I love your recentering the human and our developmental journey and experience at the center of your work there. So I'm super appreciative. I'm cheering you to make your crawl across the driveway of glass. I, for one, be on the other side with my $25 to buy your book when it comes out.
Okay, thanks very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
And we'll be talking about it here in the Zoom group, obviously, when it's ready.
Awesome. Thanks, David. Thank you, Steve, so much. This was fantastic. I'm excited to read the book. And as he mentioned, Ilia Delio will be our next guest in November. That's going to be November 13th. So I hope we'll see you all there for that. I'm super excited. That's all I got.
Thank you, everyone. Look forward to seeing you next month.
Thanks, Rigel and Steve.
All right.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Steve.
Bye. Thanks, everyone. See you
Thank you
next
very much.
month.
Bye.
Thank you.